Mark Weisbrot is the co-founder of Center for Economic and Policy Research. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. He's the author of the book Failed: What the Experts Got Wrong About Global Economy. And he's the co-author with Dean Baker of Social Security, The Phony Crises, and has written numbers of research papers on economic policy. His opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Guardian, and almost every major newspaper, as well as in Brazil's largest newspaper, Folha de Sao Paulo. Hopefully I pronounced that right. He appears regularly on national and local television and radio programs. Mark, your research has helped so many of us understand the microeconomic and system implications of US sanctions. Can you walk us through the broader global impact and what it means for how we define human rights and international law?
Try and thank all three of you, Danny and Hanieh, for providing so much of the information that I can now skip, but also is really important. That's the important part. And yeah, I'll say, the things that you asked about it, but also I do want to say something about how we might be able to change it, because we spend a lot of our life at the Center for Economic and Policy Research trying to move Congress. And it's not because we have any illusions about anything, but it's because they're the least unaccountable part of government that we have. And it is possible over time, and it has been possible to move them on these kinds of issues. First of all, to start out with the sanctions, they really are, as Hanieh said, they're a form of warfare, and they mainly target the civilian population. And I've focused, and we have focused on the broad economic sanctions, the ones that target a big sector, like in Venezuela oil, or Iran oil sector, or the whole economy with the financial sanctions. And they really are deadly. In fact, they kill hundreds of thousands of people in developing countries. There's now 25 countries under U.S. sanctions. That's grown enormously over the last few decades. You've already said some of the ways in which they kill people, but I think the biggest part is really the international finance. When they can cut that off, and Danny mentioned the states that sponsor terrorism stuff in Cuba. That's an example of it. And of course, Venezuela is an extreme example. And they cut off everything. And Iran too. The imports of medicine actually were a lot of medicines were cut off. There were, I think, 73 drugs during the sanction period that have been cut off, and 32 of them were on the World Health Organization list of essential medicines. And and of course they had exceptions for these supposedly, but it doesn't work, right? Because that's how the sanctions work. They call it overcompliance, but it's really something that the sanctions do. They encourage everybody to just boycott the country as much as possible, so they don't end up with secondary sanctions or other kinds of troubles. And also, just to say something about how the sanctions relate to this so-called system of global governance, there really are. You can see it even right now in Iran, right? It's a regime change operation. And then, when they don't succeed in doing that, then they bomb the country. And then you have the same thing. Look at Brazil. That's right now a regime change operation again. And I'm bringing these up because this is part of what the sanctions are intended to do. And it's very intentional. In fact, you had Pompeo in 2019. He was asked about the sanctions on CBS News, and he said, things are much worse for the Iranian people referring to the sanctions, and we are convinced that this will lead the Iranian people to rise up and change the behavior, he says, of the regime, which really is a regime change. And then uh, this is, I think, uh, it is a form of warfare. It actually fits if you want to think about all the horrible, indefensible things about it, you know, they also fit the kind of classic Oxford English Dictionary definition of terrorism, the use of violence to achieve political ends. And uh, and that's really what they are. And this is just to get back to Congress for a second, because I'm going to come back to that. And I always bring this in because this was one of the best things we got out of Congress when Jim McGovern was the chair of the House Rules Committee, which is a very powerful position in Congress. In 2021, he actually wrote a letter to Biden asking him to get rid of the sanctions on Venezuela. And he said, and here I'll quote it, the impact of sectoral and secondary sanctions is indiscriminate and purposely so. He's talking about the broad sanctions. And he said, although U.S. officials regularly say the sanctions target the government and not the people, the whole point of the maximum pressure campaign, and that's the one that Trump started in 2017, is to increase the economic cost to Venezuela. Economic pain is the means by which the sanctions are supposed to work. And so that is what everybody knows, but it's hard to get people to say it. Now, the reason I emphasize this so much, and then there's the illegality too, which, Hanieh mentioned in terms of collective punishment, right? It's a violation. If there were a war going on, it's just a technicality that there isn't. It's a violation of the Geneva Convention. And so it's a war crime if they were actually shooting each other. And so this is, and it violates all these other laws as well. But I think the fact that it is, it violates all these international laws, the OAS charter, the UN charter, and you have UN officials who have said this, by the way, that something and they've written and they've researched and they've said, something that's a crime when people are bombing and shooting each other ought to be a crime when they're not. Okay. So I think the reason why all these things, you can think, well, these people are cynical, they don't care. A lot of them don't, a lot of them just give in to pressure, whatever. But I think that the way we're going to win this is when it becomes indefensible, okay? When it becomes no. Because why are they so attached to this, okay? And why has it increased so much over time, the use of sanctions? As, because they have other means to threaten and punish economies. They control the IMF. They wrote the rules of the World Trade Organization, and they can use that too sometimes. They have all kinds of ways of well, now Trump has weaponized tariffs, right? And there you can see the regime change. I mean, this is the same president who helped put Lula in jail and keep him there in 2018 so he couldn't run for president. Okay. And now he's got another regime change operation. He says, you got to not prosecute Bolsonaro for trying to overthrow the government because, we want him there. Well, why do they want him there? Because they want to overthrow the government. Okay. So that's what all this stuff, obviously, and people here, I'm sure your audience already knows this. But the reason I think it's so important to go through at least some of it and the record of this so-called system of global governance that is being used to punish any country that is not basically obedient to U.S. foreign policy. And of course, 90% or more of the time, that's also European foreign policy. They haven't really had an independent foreign policy for the last 80 years. And so that is what we're dealing with. Now, why do I think we can win? I think that if you look at the War Powers Resolution, that was an example, okay? That was the war in Yemen. And it started in 2015, and it was completely absent from the media. Nobody heard of it, right? Until 2016, as a result of the kind of organizing that many of you have done, uh, you know, uh, the a couple senators started to talk about it in 2016. And then they kept pushing, and it got in the media for the first time. And then there were votes. And at first, there were only a few votes, and then there became more. And then finally, in 2018, it passed the Senate, a War Powers Resolution, which is using the 1973 War Powers Act to tell the president that he's got to get the military out of this war because it's not authorized by Congress. That's the law and the Constitution. And it passed both houses for the first time in history. And I'd say, well, the war kept going. But a lot of things did actually change that saved a lot of lives. They were killing, hundreds of thousands of people in Yemen. And and the U.S. was refueling the Saudi planes in midair, and they had to stop that. And they had to unblock the main port of Hodeida, where they were using to starve people, blocking the food shipments and the oil and energy shipments. And so it was, I would even say, if it was even a normal, horrible president, horrible on foreign policy issues, they probably would have actually stopped the war. Trump just didn't care because he doesn't care. But I think that is the main reason I bring up that example is because, and it took a few years, and we were involved in it from the beginning, went to the UN first and couldn't get it done there. And so then we went to Congress. And I think that the reason it happened was exactly that. Nobody could defend it. By 2020, every presidential candidate had to say they would stop that war, a war that most people had never heard of, but they heard about it because it became an election issue as well. And so I think that is partly what we have to do here. We have to make it, to the extent that you can get the Congress to do it, on sanctions, we had, okay, this is slow progress, but we had another letter last year, 24 members of Congress signed it, and it was co-chaired by, it was led by a co-chair of Biden's campaign. It was the year before, and it said that you had to end. It was written to Biden to end the sanctions against Venezuela and Cuba. That was the first time there was a letter like that. Now, I'm not saying it's all going to come from things like that. It was the grassroots organizing, of course, that moved members of Congress. But I think that's a big part of it. It has to become an issue that they're forced to pay attention to, and they're forced to vote on it. This is what happened. These people changed their minds because they voted on it and they were embarrassed. And they had constituents come to them and say, why are you voting to kill people in Yemen? What did they do? And so that is, I think, how we can win this fight over the long haul. There's a lot more I could say, but I think I probably went over my time already.